The crystal flute shattered against the limestone wall of our tasting room, burgundy wine spreading across the floor like blood. My fiancé, James Wellington III, stood there with his perfectly manicured hands still positioned as if holding the glass, his face twisted in disgust. "This is what you call wine?" He laughed, that cruel bark I'd grown to dread over our 3-year engagement. "No wonder your family's little hobby farm is hemorrhaging money. This tastes like vinegar mixed with disappointment." His parents, seated at our best table, tittered behind their hands. His mother, Patricia, dabbed at her lips with our best linen napkin, as if even being in our tasting room might contaminate her. "James, darling, we should go. The Rothschild estate is expecting us for dinner, and they serve actual wine." I stood frozen behind the bar, my hands trembling as I watched the wine, my grandfather's last vintage before his death, seep into the ancient floorboards. That wine had been aged for 15 years. It was irreplaceable. "Clean this up, Sophie," James commanded, not even looking at me. "And for God's sake, stop pretending this dump is anything more than a tax write-off waiting to happen. Once we're married, I'm selling this embarrassment to developers. At least a shopping mall would generate actual revenue." His father, James Jr., chuckled while checking his Patek Philippe. "Smart thinking, son. Prime real estate wasted on grapes. In this economy. Laughable." They swept out, leaving me alone with a broken glass and spilled dreams. I knelt on the floor, picking up the shards with my bare hands, not caring when one sliced my palm. The blood mixed with the wine, and I found myself thinking how appropriate that was. This vineyard was my blood, my heritage, my soul, and James wanted to destroy it. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been keeping a secret for the past 6 months. A secret that started the day after my grandfather's funeral, when I discovered something extraordinary in the cellar he'd always kept locked. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why James' mockery that day was the final straw, you need to understand what came before. You need to understand what this vineyard meant, what my family had sacrificed, and what James had already taken from me. Our story begins 15 years ago when I was 12 and still believed in fairy tales. Chateau Beaumont had been in my mother's family for 6 generations. 150 acres of rolling hills in the Napa Valley, with vines that dated back to the 1890s. When I was young, it was magical. Endless rows of grapes that changed with the seasons, from bare, twisted wood in winter to explosions of green in spring, heavy with purple fruit by autumn. My grandfather, Henri Beaumont, was a master vintner who'd learned from his father before him. He could tell you everything about a vintage just by smelling the cork. He knew every vine on our property by heart, could predict the weather by how the leaves turned in the wind, and made wine that had once been served at the White House. That was before the fire. When I was 12, a wildfire tore through Napa Valley. We lost 60% of our vines, our main production facility, and almost lost the house. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. My parents mortgaged everything to rebuild. My father, who'd married into the family and learned the business from my grandfather, worked 18-hour days. My mother, the Beaumont heir, sold her jewelry, her car, everything of value to keep us afloat. "The vines will grow back," Grandfather Henry would say, his weathered hands patting my shoulder. "Beaumont women are like our grapes. We grow stronger under pressure." But the pressure nearly crushed us. The new vines would take years to mature. Our production dropped to almost nothing. Restaurants canceled contracts. Distributors found other suppliers. My parents aged a decade in 2 years, and then my father had his heart attack. He was only 45, but the stress had eaten him alive. He survived, but could never work the vineyard again. The medical bills pushed us further into debt. My mother tried to run everything alone, but it was too much. By the time I was 16, we were facing foreclosure. That's when the Wellingtons entered our lives. James Wellington Jr. was a real estate developer who'd made his fortune buying distressed properties and flipping them. He offered to invest in our vineyard, not enough to save it entirely, but enough to keep the banks at bay. The catch? His son, James III, would be involved in the business. James was 24 to my 16, fresh out of Harvard Business School, and devastating to look at. Tall, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of our oak barrels. When he smiled at me that first day, I felt my teenage heart skip. "Don't worry, Sophie," he'd said, taking my hand. I'm going to help save your family's legacy. For 2 years, he seemed to do just that. He modernized our operations, brought in new equipment, set up online sales. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about wine. My grandfather was suspicious. "That boy has calculator eyes," he'd mutter, but my parents were grateful. The vineyard stabilized, though we were far from profitable. When I turned 18, James asked me out. My mother was thrilled. "A Wellington and a Beaumont," she sighed. "It's perfect. The business arrangement will become a family one." The courtship was a whirlwind. James took me to restaurants I'd only read about, bought me designer dresses, introduced me to a world of wealth I'd never imagined. When he proposed on my 21st birthday with a 5-carat diamond, I said yes immediately. That's when everything changed. Once the ring was on my finger, James dropped his mask. The charm turned to control, the attention became criticism. He started making decisions about the vineyard without consulting my family. He hired his friends for key positions, pushing out employees who'd been with us for decades. He changed our wine blends, going for quantity over quality. "Traditional methods are outdated," he'd say when my grandfather protested. "This is business, not sentiment." My grandfather fought him at every turn, but James had the contracts on his side. The investment agreement gave the Wellingtons significant control. The more grandfather resisted, the nastier James became. "Your grandfather is senile," James told me one night after a particularly heated argument about harvesting schedules. "He should be in a home, not interfering with progress." "He built this vineyard," I defended. James grabbed my wrist, squeezing just hard enough to hurt, and he nearly lost it. "Remember who's saving it, Sophie. Remember who you belong to." I should have left then, but I was 22, insecure, and terrified of what would happen to my family's vineyard if the Wellingtons pulled their investment. So I stayed, and I watched James slowly destroy everything my grandfather had built. He replaced our old oak barrels with cheap steel tanks. He hired cut-rate seasonal workers instead of our experienced crew. He pushed for earlier harvest to increase yield, not caring that the grapes weren't ready. The quality of our wine plummeted. "No one cares about boutique wines anymore," James would say. "Volume is king." My grandfather grew sicker watching his life's work be dismantled. My parents were too beaten down to fight, and I was trapped, engaged to a man who grew crueler by the day. James controlled everything about my life, what I wore, who I saw, where I went. He monitored my phone, my emails, my bank accounts. When I tried to take a sommelier course to improve my wine knowledge, he laughed. "Why would you need that? You're going to be my wife, not some working girl. Your job is to look pretty and produce heirs." The vineyard continued to decline. Our reputation, built over 6 generations, crumbled in 3 years. We went from producing award-winning wines to bulk swill sold to discount chains. The morning Grandfather Henry died, he held my hand and whispered, "The old cellar. Remember the old cellar?" I thought he was delirious. Everyone knew about the old cellar. It was just a locked room in the basement that had been damaged in the earthquake of 1989 and sealed off for safety reasons. But after his funeral, something made me go looking for the key. I found it in his desk, hidden inside a hollowed-out book about viticulture. The key was attached to a note in his shaky handwriting. "For Sophie, when she's ready to save Beaumont." That night, while James was at a poker game with his business partners, I crept down to the old cellar. The door was behind a rack of cheap wines James had ordered in bulk. I moved them aside and fitted the key into the lock that hadn't been turned in decades. The door opened to reveal not a damaged storage room, but a perfectly preserved cellar. And inside were hundreds of bottles of wine. Not just any wine. Chateau Beaumont vintages dating back 50 years. Wines from before the fire, from harvests that had won international medals, from years when our vineyard was mentioned in the same breath as Chateau Margaux and Romanée-Conti. But that wasn't the miraculous part. In the corner, behind a false wall I discovered by accident when I leaned against it, was another room. This one contained just 12 bottles, each one meticulously labeled in my great-great-grandmother's hand. The dates went back to 1892, the first year Beaumont vines produced wine. And beside them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal. The journal belonged to Marie Claire Beaumont, my ancestor who'd started the Vineyard with her husband after emigrating from Bordeaux. But he had died young, leaving her with 3 children and a failing vineyard in a time when women couldn't even vote, much less run a business. According to her journal, Marie Claire had discovered something extraordinary: a natural yeast that existed only on our land in a specific grove of oak trees on the eastern hill. This yeast, when cultivated properly, created wine of unprecedented complexity and beauty. She'd kept it secret, passing the knowledge only to her daughter, who passed it to hers, and so on. But the tradition had been broken. My grandmother had died when my mother was young, before she could pass on the secret. My grandfather had known something was missing from our wines, but could never figure out what. Marie Claire's journal contained everything: the location of the trees, the method of cultivation, the precise timing and temperature for fermentation. And most remarkably, she'd preserved samples of the yeast itself, dried and stored in special containers that had miraculously survived over a century. I spent the next 6 months in secret, working at night when James was asleep or away. I cultivated the yeast following Marie Claire's instructions to the letter. I selected our best grapes from a small plot James had overlooked because it was too difficult to harvest with machines. I made 5 cases of wine using the traditional method, the ancient yeast, and every ounce of knowledge I'd absorbed from my grandfather over the years. I hid them in the secret cellar to age, telling no one, not even my parents. During those months, James grew worse. He started talking about our wedding, planned for the following spring. But more often, he talked about what would happen after. "Once we're married, I'm putting your parents in a retirement home," he announced one evening. "This house is worth millions as a boutique hotel. We'll live in my penthouse in the city." "This is their home," I protested. "Not for long. The paperwork is already drawn up. The moment you say, 'I do,' your shares in the vineyard become marital property. Combined with my family's stake, I'll have controlling interest. I can do whatever I want." He was right. I'd checked with a lawyer secretly. The way the contracts were structured, marriage to James would give him everything. "Why are you even marrying me?" I asked one night, exhausted from the emotional abuse. "Because it's cleaner than a hostile takeover," he said simply, "and because I enjoy watching you squirm. You were so proud when we met, so certain your little vineyard was something special. Now look at you, you're nothing without me." 3 weeks before our wedding, I bottled my secret wine. The color was perfect, deep purple with hints of ruby. The aroma was intoxicating. But I wouldn't know if I'd succeeded until it was tasted, and I couldn't risk James finding out. That's when fate intervened. I was at the farmer's market buying flowers for my grandfather's grave when I overheard 2 women talking. One was complaining about the difficulty of finding American wines for some royal competition. "The palace specifically requested American boutique wines for consideration," she said. "The Queen wants to expand the royal warrant selections. But everything I've tasted is either mass-produced garbage or overpriced pretension." The royal warrant. I knew about it, of course. It was the highest honor in the wine world, official recognition as a supplier to the British royal family. Only a handful of American wines had ever received it. I followed the women, my heart pounding. When they stopped at a coffee stand, I approached. "Excuse me," I said. I couldn't help overhearing. "I'm Sophie Beaumont from Chateau Beaumont Vineyard." The older woman, elegant in understated designer clothes, looked at me skeptically. "Beaumont? Didn't you used to produce decent wines? I heard you've gone commercial." "We have," I admitted. "But I've been working on something special. A traditional vintage using methods from the 1890s. If you're looking for something unique." She studied me for a long moment. "I'm Margaret Thornberry, Master of Wine and consultant to the royal household. This is my assistant, Emma." She pulled out a card. "Send me a bottle. If it's worthwhile, I'll consider it for submission." I sent 3 bottles the next day using our old labels I'd found in grandfather's desk, not the garish new ones James had designed. Then I waited. The response came a week later, the day James had torn apart our tasting room. After cleaning up his mess, I sat in the empty room reading Margaret's email on my phone. "Miss Beaumont, your wine is extraordinary. I've seldom tasted anything with such complexity and elegance. I would like to submit it for the royal competition immediately. Please confirm you can provide 12 bottles for the formal tasting." I confirmed, my hands shaking. Then I did something else. I called off my wedding. James laughed when I told him. We were at his penthouse and he was drinking scotch that cost more than most people's rent. You can't call off the wedding, Sophie. The invitations are sent, the contracts are signed, you're mine. I'm done, James. Keep your investment. We'll find another way. He threw his glass against the wall, scotch splashing across his white carpet. You stupid little bitch. You think you have a choice? Your family owes us $3 million. That loan comes due the day after our wedding. Either you marry me or I foreclose on everything. I hadn't known about the acceleration clause in the loan. James had hidden that detail, saving it as his final trap. Then foreclose, I said, though my heart was breaking. I won't marry you. You have 2 weeks to reconsider, he said coldly. After that, I take everything. The vineyard, the house, even that pathetic secret cellar your grandfather kept locked. My blood froze. You know about the cellar? I've always known. I had cameras installed months ago. I know you've been sneaking around down there. Whatever cheap wine you're hiding won't save you. He grabbed my arm, pulling me close. You're going to marry me, Sophie. You're going to smile at our wedding, and then you're going to watch while I demolish every vine on that property and build a shopping mall, and there's nothing you can do about it. I left his penthouse in tears, but not defeated tears. Angry tears, determined tears. Because James had made one crucial mistake. He'd seen me go into the cellar, but the cameras couldn't see inside. He didn't know about the secret room, the ancient yeast, or the wine I'd submitted to the royal competition. The next 2 weeks were torture. James called constantly, alternating between threats and false apologies. He sent flowers, then dead roses. He had his lawyers send foreclosure notices, then offer extensions if I'd just be reasonable. My parents were distraught. Just marry him, my mother begged. We'll lose everything otherwise. Trust me, I said, though I couldn't explain why. The royal competition was in 3 days, but the results wouldn't be announced for another week. If my wine didn't win, we'd lose the vineyard before anyone knew how special it was. Then Margaret Thornberry called. Sophie, I have unusual news. The Queen herself tasted your wine at a private dinner. She wants to meet you. Can you fly to London tomorrow? I used the last of my savings for a plane ticket. I wore my grandmother's vintage Chanel suit, the one she'd been married in, the only designer thing our family still owned that James didn't know about. The meeting was at Buckingham Palace. I was so nervous I could barely speak, but the Queen was surprisingly warm. This wine, she said, holding a glass of my creation, reminds me of something my grandmother served at her coronation. There's something timeless about it, something that speaks to history and tradition while remaining entirely fresh. She paused. Tell me about your vineyard. So I told her everything. The 6 generations, the fire, the struggle to rebuild, James and his family's destruction of our legacy, the secret cellar, Marie Claire's journal, the ancient yeast that existed nowhere else in the world. And this man, your fiancé, he wants to destroy it all? He's not my fiancé anymore, I said firmly. But yes, in 5 days he'll foreclose on our loans and tear down 150 years of history. The Queen set down her glass and looked at her secretary. Harold, what does our agricultural preservation fund look like this year? Quite healthy, Your Majesty. She turned back to me. Miss Beaumont, the royal family has a tradition of supporting historical agricultural sites. Would a loan of $5 million at 0% interest over 30 years help your situation? I nearly fainted. Your Majesty, that would save everything. Consider it done, but on one condition. She smiled. You must promise to teach others about these traditional methods. Real winemaking, not this industrial nonsense flooding the market. Of course, Your Majesty. Of course. Oh, and Sophie? She picked up her glass again. Your wine has been awarded the royal warrant. The announcement will be made tomorrow, simultaneously with the loan approval. I believe that should help with your domestic situation. I flew home in a daze. The loan documents arrived by diplomatic courier the next morning, just as James was pulling up to the house with his lawyers and a demolition crew. Time's up, Sophie, he called out, smirking. Sign the marriage certificate, or watch while we tear this place apart. Actually, James, I said, holding up the royal seal on the loan documents, you're the one who needs to leave. His lawyer grabbed the papers, read them, and went pale. "Mr. Wellington, this is a royal decree. The British Crown has paid off all debts on this property and established it as a historical agricultural site. You have no claim here." "That's impossible." James snatched the papers. "She doesn't have that kind of connection. She's nobody." That's when my phone rang. Margaret Thornbury's number. "Sophie, darling, turn on the BBC. You'll want to see this." I pulled up the stream on my phone, casting it to the old TV in our tasting room. The whole family, James, his parents, and the lawyers crowded around to watch. "In an unprecedented move," the announcer said, "Her Majesty has personally awarded the royal warrant to an American wine for the first time in history. Chateau Beaumont, a small family vineyard in Napa Valley, has been recognized for their extraordinary traditional vintage. The Queen called it the finest wine I've tasted in 50 years. The room went silent. Then James' father spoke, his voice weak. "The royal warrant? Do you understand what this means for the wine's value?" "The first bottles will auction at Sotheby's next month," the announcer continued. "Experts estimate they could fetch upwards of $50,000 per bottle, given the royal endorsement, and the revelation that the wine uses a yeast strain that exists nowhere else on Earth." James had gone paper white. His hands shook as he stared at me. How did you?" "The same way my great-great-grandmother did it," I said simply. "Hard work, tradition, and a respect for the land you tried to destroy." His mother was calculating on her phone. 12 bottles at 50,000. That's 600,000 just from the first auction. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone to show them an email that had just arrived, "Sotheby's pre-auction estimate just came in. Given the publicity, they're estimating 75,000 per bottle, and I have 5 cases in the cellar." James made a strangled sound. 5 cases? That's over $2 million. $4.5 million, actually, I corrected. "And that's just the beginning. I have enough yeast to produce 50 cases next year. Every restaurant in the world will want allocation. Every collector will bid whatever it takes." "Sophie," James tried, his voice desperate now. "Sophie, we can work this out. We're engaged. That makes it community property." "We're not engaged," I said, pulling off the ring and handing it to him. "And even if we were, the vineyard is now protected by international treaty. It can never be sold or developed. It can only produce wine using traditional methods forever." James' father stood up slowly. "You've cost us millions in potential development." "No," I said. "You cost yourselves millions by trying to destroy something irreplaceable. You thought land was just commodity, wine was just inventory, tradition was just inefficiency. You never understood that some things are valuable precisely because they can't be mass-produced or replicated." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The story went viral. Young vintner saves family vineyard with secret recipe, wins royal warrant. Every major publication wanted interviews. The Food Network offered me a show. Wine Spectator put me on their cover. But the best moment came during the Sotheby's auction. James was there, of course. He couldn't help himself. He sat in the back watching as bottle after bottle sold for astronomical sums. The final bottle went for $93,000 to a collector from Tokyo. When I walked past him afterward, he grabbed my wrist. Not hard this time. He was too broken for that. "I could have made you rich," he whispered. "I was already rich," I replied, pulling free. "I had family, heritage, and purpose. You tried to take all of that away to make money. Now I have money too, and you have nothing. I still have my properties, my developments." "Actually," I interrupted, "you might want to check the news. The SEC announced an investigation into Wellington properties this morning. Something about fraudulent loans and embezzlement. Your father's assets have been frozen." He went even paler if that was possible. You reported us?" "I didn't have to. Turns out when you make international news for trying to destroy a now royal heritage site, people start looking into your other business practices. You destroyed a lot of other family businesses before ours, James. Those families, remember?" I left him standing there and walked out into the California sunshine. My parents were waiting by our old truck, the one James had always mocked. My mother was crying happy tears. My father, despite his weak heart, had never looked stronger. "Grandfather would be so proud," Mom said, hugging me. "He knew. I said, thinking of his final words about the cellar. Somehow, he knew I'd find it when I needed it most. We drove home to Chateau Beaumont, where workers were already restoring our old equipment, where the vines were being tended by our original crew, rehired at double their old wages, where the old oak barrels were being brought out of storage. 6 months later, I was in our restored tasting room, teaching a masterclass to young vintners from around the world when my assistant knocked. "Sophie, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your ex-fiancé." I found James in the parking lot, sitting in a beaten-up Honda Civic. He'd lost weight, his designer clothes replaced by ill-fitting jeans and a faded t-shirt. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly. I wanted you to know I'm sorry and to ask, do you think you could ever forgive me?" I studied him for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "I forgive you, James," I said finally. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. You showed me who you really are, and that person can never be part of my life again." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. I wanted you to know that losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Worse than losing the money, the business, everything. You were the only real thing in my life, and I destroyed it." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did." He drove away, and I never saw him again. I heard later that he'd moved to the Midwest, got a job as a junior accountant, married a kindergarten teacher who knew nothing about his past. Perhaps he learned something. Perhaps not. It wasn't my concern anymore. A year later, I stood in the same spot where James had shattered that glass. But now the tasting room was full of light and laughter. Wine journalists from every major publication were there for our official reopening. The walls were lined with awards, including the framed royal warrant, displayed prominently above my grandfather's portrait. Margaret Thornberry was there, having become a dear friend. The Queen had sent a personal note of congratulations. Even Gordon Ramsay had come, declaring our wine fucking brilliant on camera, which had already gone viral. But the best part was seeing my parents, healthy and happy, greeting guests like the royalty they'd always been in the wine world. My father, with a new pacemaker and strict orders to take it easy, was telling stories about the old days. My mother was showing off the ancient vines that had survived everything, still producing fruit after 130 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, raising a glass of our newest vintage, made with Marie Claire's yeast but my own innovative blend. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I prefer mine at exactly 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with notes of blackberry, oak, and sweet, sweet justice. The crowd laughed and toasted, cameras flashed, orders poured in from around the world, and that night, after everyone had gone, I walked alone through the vineyard. The moon was full, casting silver light on the ancient vines. I could almost feel my ancestors walking with me. Marie Claire, who'd kept her secret through poverty and prejudice. My grandmother, who'd died too young but passed on her strength. My grandfather, who'd hidden our heritage until I was ready to find it. I thought about James, probably lying awake in some small apartment, remembering what he'd thrown away. I thought about his parents, their empire crumbled, their reputation destroyed. They'd wanted to build a shopping mall here, a monument to commercialism and greed. Instead, these vines would outlive us all. In 100 years, someone else would walk these rows, making wine from the same yeast Marie Claire had discovered, continuing a tradition that James had tried so hard to break. The Wellingtons had thought they were stealing a failing business. They never understood they were trying to destroy something priceless, a legacy written in soil and seasons, in careful hands and patient hearts, in the mysterious alchemy that turns grapes into poetry. I raised my glass to the moon, to my ancestors, to the land itself. "Thank you," I whispered. The wind rustled through the vines, and I swear I heard my grandfather's voice in it. "Well done, little one, well done." 5 years have passed since that night. Chateau Beaumont is now one of the most exclusive wineries in the world. We produce only 200 cases a year, each bottle selling for thousands. We have a waiting list that stretches 10 years into the future. I never married. I've had relationships, but I'm careful now, protective of what I've built. Trust, once shattered like James shattered that glass, is not easily repaired. But I'm not alone. The vineyard is full of life. We run an apprenticeship program for young women wanting to learn traditional winemaking. I teach them everything, not just the technical skills, but the history, the stories, the secret knowledge passed down through generations. Last week, one of my apprentices, a young woman from Guatemala whose family had lost their coffee farm to developers, found me in the cellar. Sophie, she said, eyes shining, I think I found something. A mutation in the yeast that might make it even more effective? I smiled, remembering my own discovery in this same cellar. Show me, I said. She led me to her microscope where she'd isolated a strain that seemed to accelerate fermentation while maintaining complexity. It was brilliant work, the kind of innovation that comes from understanding tradition so deeply that you can improve upon it without destroying it. What should we call it? She asked. I thought for a moment. How about the Phoenix strain, for things that rise from the ashes? She grinned. Perfect. That evening, I received an unexpected package. No return address, just a small box with my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was the engagement ring I'd returned to James 5 years ago, along with a note. This belongs to your family's history, not mine. I'm returning it so you can give it to someone worthy or sell it to fund another apprentice. I follow your success from afar and am genuinely happy for you. You were right about everything. Some things are too precious to be owned, only stewarded. I'm sorry I learned that too late. J. I held the ring up to the light. 5 carats of crystallized ego and control. Tomorrow, I'd take it to San Francisco and sell it. The money would fund scholarships for 5 more apprentices. But tonight, I had wine to make. The harvest moon was rising, and the grapes were perfect, ready to begin their transformation from fruit to art. Marie Claire's yeast was bubbling in the fermentation tanks, alive after more than a century, ready to work its ancient magic once more. I thought about James, somewhere in the Midwest, finally understanding what he'd lost. I hoped he'd found peace, maybe even redemption. But that was his journey, not mine. Mine was here, in this cellar that had sheltered our secrets, on this land that had sustained our dreams, with these vines that had outlasted every attempt to destroy them. The Wellington family had tried to bury us. They never realized we were seeds. And seeds, given time and the right conditions, always find a way to grow toward the light.